Hello, I'm Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, the Director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. Welcome back to our video series on the competition with China. In some of our other videos, we've discussed in detail the various parts of the People's Liberation Army, their mission, organization, equipment, as well as other detailed topics. Today, we're going to be taking a much broader overview and a historical perspective of Chinese military strategy. Dr. Joel Wuthnow is the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Study of Chinese Military Affairs at National Defense University. Dr. Wuthnow is going to walk us through the evolution of the PRC's military strategy and talk about how it's evolved and where it stands today.
China is preparing for a future conflict. Of that, there is no doubt. China's Communist Party has a formal military strategy that answers some pretty fundamental questions about the use of military power. Who, where, and over what should the People's Liberation Army be prepared to fight? And what kind of operations does it need to be able to conduct? In this lecture, I'll offer a historical perspective on how Chinese military strategy has evolved over time and focus on what their strategy looks like today. The takeaway is that the PLA is mostly focused on high-intensity combat operations within Asia, focusing on Taiwan, though a key task is keeping the US out of the fight. They are also giving a lot of thought to what the character of war might look like in the future and are already shifting some key resources in new directions. The historical context can extend all the way back to ancient China. There was a strong realpolitik tradition emphasizing the utility of military power all the way back to the 5th century BC. This strain of thought held that violent conflict is unavoidable, offensive strategies are favorable, and flexibility should be used in unfavorable circumstances. Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese general who is credited with writing the famous Art of War, provided his thoughts on how weaker forces can defeat the strong through deception and cunning, and how the strong can win without fighting by amassing and displaying far superior forces. His maxims, written 2,500 years ago, became one of the 7 military classics of ancient China and survived into the modern day. Mao Zedong, who led a conventionally weaker army through much of the 1930s and 40s, quoted Sun Tzu and developed his own military philosophy based on the actual conditions he was facing. Mao proposed a strategy of luring the enemy deep into territory controlled by his Red Army and weakening them through unconventional strikes and raids, meanwhile mobilizing the population and slowly building conventional might. These principles allowed him to defeat both the Japanese invasion of China and the KMT in the Chinese Civil War. Mao wrote favorably about what he called an active defense. At the strategic level, he thought that wars should be defensive, protecting one's own territory and key interests, rather than offensive for the purpose of seizing foreign territory or colonizing foreign populations. But he also opposed what he called a passive defense. In other words, a World War I style strategy of digging into trenches and waiting passively for the enemy to strike first. He said a strategic defense should be combined with a strong offense at the tactical and campaign levels, harassing, striking, and attacking the enemy to weaken his resolve and deplete his resources. After the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, active defense became the core principle of China's military strategy. Mao was not at all hesitant to use force. Under his watch, China intervened against the United States in the Korean War, supported the North Vietnamese and various insurgencies in Southeast Asia, struck deep into Indian territory during a border conflict in 1962, and skirmished with Soviet troops along the contested border in 1969. Yet all of these actions, even those that involved striking across borders, were framed politically as defensive, punishing adversaries that had dared to cross China's red lines. The 1979 border conflict with Vietnam, fought under Mao's successor Deng Xiaoping, was also framed as a strategically defensive campaign designed to teach Vietnam a lesson after they had attacked the China-backed Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. China has not fought a war since 1979, but Chinese military theorists continue to update the theory of active defense. In a hypothetical future conflict, Chinese writers suggest that the PLA could throw the first punch to knock out an enemy such as Taiwan. Modern warfare benefits from speed and surprise, which give the first mover an advantage. Even if the PLA moved first, however, such operations would still be framed as defensive, needed to respond to the threats created by others against China's interests, in this case, responding to the activities and perceived provocations of the Taiwan independence movement. Don't, in other words, expect the PLA not to strike first simply because they use the language of defense. So if active defense is the principle of Chinese military strategy, what is its actual contents? Formally speaking, China's Central Military Commission, which is the highest decision-making body for the PLA, periodically updates an assessment called the Military Strategic Guidelines. This is roughly analogous to the US National Military Strategy or Defense Planning Guidance. The guidelines take into account two major considerations. First are threats in China's security environment that require the PLA to prepare for specific contingencies. Second are changes in the character of war based on Chinese perceptions of foreign technological advances and operations. So the guidelines blend what we would call contingency-based planning with capabilities-based planning. The guidelines contain answers to those key strategic questions. Who, where, and over what should the PLA be prepared to fight, and what kinds of operations does it need to be able to conduct? These judgments, in turn, influence key decisions, including operational doctrine, acquisition, force posture, training, and budgeting. Since 1949, the guidelines have been updated 10 times. During the Cold War, China's strategy was focused heavily on threats posed by the United States and the Soviet Union. Mao anticipated a possible US invasion after the Korean War, though the US threat diminished after China and the US moved towards more normal political relations in the early 1970s. The Soviet threat grew gradually after the rupture of the Sino-Soviet alliance in 1960, and PLA planning focused on a possible Soviet invasion along China's northern frontier in the 1970s and 1980s during the height of the Brezhnev buildup. During these years, China's military strategy focused on Mao's principle of warfare. Lure the enemy in deep and then fight campaigns based on mobility and unconventional operations. The threat of a superpower war also led Mao to focus heavily on developing a credible nuclear deterrent, which kicked off with China's first nuclear test in 1964. Things began to change in the late 1980s. China, by this time, had already established diplomatic relations with the United States and had moved towards a rapprochement with the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. Deng Xiaoping instructed the PLA to focus less on superpower conflict, which he saw as unlikely, and more on what he called local wars, small-scale conventional conflicts involving China's neighbors. The border conflict with Vietnam was an example of a local war. The real pivot in China's military strategy, however, came in 1993. That year, the Central Military Commission under Deng's successor, Jiang Zemin, adopted a fundamentally different strategy. Both the geographic focus of PLA operations and the nature of the operations the PLA would need to be able to conduct shifted. The 1993 strategy clearly identified Taiwan as the PLA's major opponent and focused PLA developments and operations along the southeast coast. The reason was the Chinese leaders were increasingly concerned about political trends on Taiwan, including the rise of a new generation of leaders who were born in Taiwan and saw no future with the mainland, and the loosening of political restrictions that allowed the Taiwan independence movement to flourish. They were also concerned about an uptick in US arms sales to Taiwan that followed US sanctions on China after the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown. So, the PLA needed to be able to, first and foremost, deter Taiwan independence. This meant a large increase in China's short-range ballistic missile arsenal based close to the Taiwan Strait, as well as more attention to amphibious training. This judgment was confirmed by the 1995 to 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis. During that episode, Taiwan's president made a provocative visit to the United States, and following PLA missile tests near Taiwan, the US sailed 2 carrier battle groups into the region. This prompted the PLA to put more attention on how they could deter US intervention in a future Taiwan Strait conflict. We saw after this incident much larger PLA budgets that went, among other things, into the development of long-range conventional missile forces. Counter-intervention, or what we would call A2AD challenges in the Pacific, increased greatly in the following years. 1993 also saw a major change in the type of operations the PLA would need to conduct. During the Cold War, the PLA prepared mainly for land operations. The ground forces were historically the largest and most important of the services, and were critical to the kinds of mobile and guerrilla operations the PLA would need to conduct to counter an invasion by one of the superpowers. By the early 1990s, however, PLA leaders understood that future battlefield success would require joint operations. This was essential to modern campaigns that the PLA had witnessed, including the British success in the 1982 Falkland Island Wars and the US success in the Gulf War. Joint operations would be especially important in a Taiwan conflict. Island landings are, of course, inherently joint. The implications of this were greater attention to joint doctrine and training, as well as a series of force reductions that reduced the Army and increased the size and influence of the other services. 1993 set the fundamental direction for the PLA, a path they continued on for the next 30 years. Later changes to the military strategic guidelines sought to deepen and improve the strategy. An update in 2004, made under Hu Jintao, focused the PLA on what he called local wars under conditions of informationization. The heavy emphasis on the information domain during these years followed the PLA's observation of the US leveraging its superiority in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance in the Gulf War, and in later operations in the Balkans and the early days of the post-9/11 conflicts. Chinese theorists paid special attention to US debates about net-centric warfare in the 1990s that sought to apply advances in information technology into military operations and doctrine. Chinese leaders saw information technology as a comparative weakness for the PLA and decided that the next stage of modernization needed to concentrate on what they called informationization. This saw an emphasis on information-centric domains such as space, cyber, and the electromagnetic spectrum. It also saw them improving command, control, and communication systems. This also had implications for PLA personnel. Increasingly in demand were computer literate and college-educated officers and NCOs. Along with this attention to IT improvements was new thinking about joint operations. In the 1990s, the PLA focused on what they called coordinated joint operations. This referred to very superficial cooperation. Hu Jintao talked more about integrated joint operations. This required much more in-depth cooperation between the services and branches of the sort that would be needed if the PLA were ever to conduct an island landing against Taiwan. Hu Jintao's focus was not only on cross-strait operations, however. He also stressed the importance of the maritime domain in general. China was increasingly reliant on the sea in terms of trade and access to raw materials, and it had unresolved territorial disputes in the South and East China Sea. What this meant in practice was the expansion of a blue water navy, including new destroyers and the beginnings of a fleet of aircraft carriers, as well as the rapid growth of the other maritime services, especially the Coast Guard and the Maritime Militia. Late in the Hu era, China became much more assertive in dealing with maritime disputes, using these maritime capabilities to intimidate opponents. Beginning in 2008, the PLA also sent its Navy more regularly overseas in the context of anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, which offered experience managing a Far Seas Navy. This experience would be vital in laying the groundwork for protecting sea lanes and resolving what WHO referred to as the Malacca Dilemma, referring to over-reliance on energy shipments through the Strait of Malacca and other vulnerable maritime choke points. Xi Jinping came to the scene in November 2012 as the new chairman of the Central Military Commission. In 2014, the CMC approved a new update to the military strategic guidelines. These kept the focus on Taiwan, integrated joint operations, and maritime operations, but also kicked off an important structural reform to the PLA that began in earnest at the end of 2015. Xi's reforms were about posturing the PLA to more effectively conduct joint operations. The focus was on the command structure. Despite the downsizings of the 1990s and the 2000s, the PLA command structure was still heavily service-centric and weighted toward the ground forces. The Army held almost all positions of authority in the PLA. The reforms created full-fledged joint commands at the national level through the Joint Staff Department, and also at the regional level through 5 theater commands. The theater commanders would have at their disposal air and naval forces. This would facilitate joint training in peacetime and a more rapid transition to wartime operations. Xi also oversaw another reduction in force, bringing the size of the ground forces down by 300,000 personnel while expanding the Navy and Air Force. What Xi was trying to do then was not so much about changing the direction of China's military strategy as it was about more effectively fulfilling the vision that was outlined 20 years earlier in 1993. This brings us up to the present, but what can we say about the future? For the time being, the PLA will continue to focus on Taiwan and deterring US intervention in a Taiwan Strait conflict. Xi Jinping has also been very clear that the PLA needs to be prepared for conflict elsewhere along China's extensive periphery. Taiwan may be what the PLA calls the main strategic direction or primary theater, but there is also the possibility of conflict elsewhere, such as the Korean Peninsula, the Sino-Indian border, or the South China Sea. And so the PLA needs to maintain readiness all around. Xi has also been more willing to escalate other territorial disputes. It was under his leadership, for instance, that China militarized the South China Sea through land reclamation in the Spratlys and new military outposts in that region. So, we should anticipate that the PLA will try to balance its preparations for a major war with Taiwan against other requirements in other theaters and globally. The real innovations we're likely to see in China's military strategy, however, is likely to be in the realm of technology. The military strategic guidelines have focused, up until now, on the information domain, but Chinese doctrine is already anticipating a shift towards the next stage of modernization, what they call intelligentization. This concept refers to the rise of technologies in fields such as artificial intelligence, hypersonics, quantum technology, nanotechnology, advanced materials, and unmanned systems. Some of these are already being incorporated into militaries worldwide, and China itself has made some advances. The DF-17 hypersonic-fitted long-range ballistic missile is just one example. The task for Chinese military strategists now is determining how new technology can be blended into the current force structure and doctrine. How would these systems be used in campaigns against Taiwan, another regional antagonist such as Japan, or the United States? How will they balance near-term readiness with long-term investments in new technology? And what kinds of relationships will the PLA need with China's Silicon Valley to best exploit those technological advances? Xi Jinping has also talked about forging a world-class military defined by advanced capabilities and operational concepts. Building such a force by the middle of the 21st century is the formal goal for the PLA set by the CCP Party Congress in November 2017. What this looks like in practice will be determined by 2 things. First is how China's strategic landscape develops over the next few decades. Will the PLA still need to prepare for a Taiwan contingency, or will the two sides have reached a political settlement? What other regional and global tasks will the PLA need to be able to conduct? Second is how the PLA participates in the global revolution in military affairs. Will they leapfrog ahead of the United States and acquire truly cutting-edge equipment, or will they still feel themselves to be lagging behind? Under Xi Jinping, the PLA has tried to perfect the 1993 strategy, but changes around the bend could launch the PLA in a new direction. And it is incumbent on us to figure out what that might be and what needs to be done to prepare for such a future.